I think I know where it is.
Amanda?
Here.
Oh, yes.
I'll give you 2 minutes.
Okay, I have to enable content. Something is not working here. Very good. Very good. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to present some of the recent work that we have done. So I will focus my presentation on energy investment needs for the Paris Agreement as well as for achieving sustainable development. I basically present results from a recent paper which we did also for this conference, and we started relatively small. Basically, David McCallum, who you see up there, and myself started to write a paper about energy investments. And when we talked to the community about looking at investments in a more detailed way, the interest was pretty big. So from starting with 2 different authors, we ended up with more than, I think, 20 different authors from six different institutions looking into basically the investment needs for well below 2-degree scenarios. I would say one of the new things that you will see here is the difference between specific pathways that try to achieve 1.5 degrees compared to 2 degrees, because very often they are mentioned together, but they mean quite different things. And then also some implications of the big transformations that are necessary for investments on the SDGs. Because if you do any investment in the energy sector directed towards climate, this will have implications for the feasibility and for the cost of other important objectives in society, being health, water, being poverty, or any investments other than climate-related investments. Obviously, we took in our paper the Paris Agreement and the SDGs as a starting point, the 2 important different international agreements. And we first of all looked into the order of magnitude of change. I think most of you, or all of you, will be aware that staying, for example, to below 2 degrees requires a very deep and a very rapid transformation. And what you can see here are greenhouse gas emissions from ranges across different models that have implemented in detail the nationally determined contributions. So basically what have countries pledged after the Paris Agreement, and have compared that to scenarios which try to follow a 2-degree pathway. And as you can see here, in 2-degree pathways, basically emissions need to peak somewhere around 2020. They need to be rapidly reduced because of to decarbonization. Electrification has been mentioned, efficiency, but also rapid upscaling for zero carbon power to bring down emissions. And roughly around 2070, emissions need to be zero. And then thereafter, in some scenarios, we see negative emissions. In other scenarios, we don't see the need of negative emissions. So the portfolio is very important. You don't need to have negative emissions in the long term for a 2-degree pathway. I think that's important to recognize because it is discussed quite controversially at the moment. Then if you look at 2 and 1.5 degree pathways, what's the difference here? The main difference is 1.5 degree pathways very rapidly decarbonize demand as well as supply in the short term. Basically, you have to do more and more quickly to achieve roughly around near zero GHG emissions by 2050. So this is CO2 and other greenhouse gases. And then virtually all scenarios that try to achieve 1.5 degrees have to some extent some sort of negative emissions, be it bioenergy plus carbon capture or be it massive afforestation. You need to make sure that basically you stay between a very, very limited budget in terms of how much CO2 can go into the atmosphere. I think the important thing to recognize is that the NDCs are by far not sufficient with a long-term goal that is also agreed in the Paris Agreement, and that this gap that we observe is enormous if we extrapolate the current policy stringency and compare it to the required policy stringency in order to achieve a 2-degree or 1.5-degree target. And in order to close this gap, we need to fundamentally change in how we invest into the energy system, and that was the main focus of the paper. So let me switch, perhaps showing you differences for those 4 different scenarios in terms of the investment portfolios. So what you can see here is basically average annual investments between now and 2050. We call the big gap in terms of greenhouse gas emissions in different parts of the energy sector. And from left to right, you can see the baseline, an NDC investment portfolio, a 2-degree and a 1.5-degree investment portfolio. I think it's what you can see is that increase in terms of in absolute investments for 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees are in the order of 20 to 30%. So investment increases are not so massive. Major part of the story is, though, if you look, for example, into 2 degrees and compare the investment portfolio of a 2-degree scenario with the baseline, the major difference is that we need to scale up investments in some areas and significantly reduce disinvest into other areas. And the prime areas of investment here that you can see are, for example, efficiency and renewables. We're talking here about $400 billion per year investment in these 2 areas. Also, we need to have increased investment into nuclear and CCS, although to a less extent. And then transmission and distribution and storage investments, these are those adjustment costs, are also very important compared to the baseline. And then you can see here relatively big disinvestments and also relatively big uncertainty bars surrounding those disinvestments in the fossil extraction sector, but as well as in the fossil power sector. Now, if we compare these investments and disinvestments to a 1.5 degree scenario, I think you can immediately see that trends are similar, but of course, investment needs into efficiency and renewables are significantly higher, and disinvestments need also to happen more quickly, which means premature retirement of existing capacity as part of the portfolio of solutions. Okay, if you think about low carbon investment shares, this is renewables, but also other low carbon options. Different models give you, at first glance, different results. But one thing that is common in all of those models is an increase of share into zero carbon options of between 70 to 80% already shortly after 2030, definitely before 2040. And this is not only the power sector, this is the total energy supply sector, including investments into refineries and into non-power. And this differs very much to current realities, where investments are in the order of 30%, a little bit above 30%, and are also expected to roughly stay at that level, given the NDCs and the different national policy plans at the moment. If you look a little bit more into detail into different regions, here are investments of 2 degree scenarios compared to the baseline. I think you can see here biggest upscaling needs in terms of investments in Asia, but also in the OECD. So most of the investments in Asia are obviously driven by growth in Asia. So economic development is one of the engines here. And you can see here OECD as the second largest basically region where investment needs in a 2-degree scenarios would arise. And this is particularly here because of replacement of capacity with new and low carbon options. So the nature of the investment in Asia and in OECD is quite different. So these are the 2 different green bars here. If you look at the regional investments in 1.5-degree scenarios, again, significant increase needed. We are talking about roughly 600 billion on average between now and 2015 Asia. This compares to roughly 1.3 billion global investments right now into the supply sector. So we are talking here about even in Asia about relatively big investment needs. So where is the regional disinvestment happening? It's not actually in OECD and in Asia. It's particularly concentrated there where we have the biggest fossil fuel exporters and resources. So the Middle East and Africa has in this analysis the biggest disinvestments in the order of up to 200 million, and followed by the Asia and OECD. So most of the disinvestments in the OECD are actually dominated by coal in the United States. And coal is perhaps the next interesting outcome of the analysis here, that if you look at 2-degree and 1.5-degree scenarios, there is no big difference in terms of coal. Basically, investments into coal would need to stop. Coal would need to be phased out relatively quickly, and even investments into coal with CCS would be relatively little across all of these different models. And the reason for that is upstream investments, for example, from coal mining and methane emissions from coal mining would by far offset the benefits from CCS in coal. So talking about losers and winners that we have heard before, that's definitely a sector which one would need to think about. Okay, these are basically the different main building blocks of investments in the energy sector. Obviously, these investments are motivated by 2 of the SDGs, which is SDG 7 and SDG 13. And investments in these areas, of course, have implications for investments in other areas in order to achieve objectives for example, for food or for health, for water or land. And what we tried in our study was to distinguish 2 different investment portfolios for the future. So one which more or less follows an NDC pathway, which is the left-hand circle that you can see here, the brown one, where fossil fuels are more or less dominant, and compare that to the investment portfolio that I just presented, which follows basically SDG 7 and SDG 13. And then look into the implications of investments of some of the SDGs in other areas. So one thing that you can see here, for example, the circle, the size of the circle is proportional to the investment needs, right? So for the left-hand side, which is more or less following the baseline, we have roughly an investment need of 2 trillion annually. On the right-hand side, the circle is bigger because it's 2.8 trillion. The implication of those investments are that, for example, in terms of investment for energy access, connecting the poor, and particularly also enabling a transition in terms of allowing access to clean cooking, it changes quite dramatically in these scenarios. We are talking about 50 billion costs in terms of policy support for the poorest, roughly 3 billion people which need to have access to clean cooking, which changes in the renewable dominated scenario and increases to roughly 200 billion. This is the 1.5-degree scenario. So this is really the most extreme climate transition that we have seen. And it needs to be noted that these 200 are, of course, a small number compared to the other compared to the transition cost in terms of the climate mitigation investments that I have shown you earlier. In terms of water, the assessment has been that, so we are calling here, we are considering here clean water and sanitation. There has been a relatively modest increase in investment needs in the water sector from these tools. If you look at the right-hand side, so it's about 900 compared to 830. And the main reason of additional needs to invest into the water sector is investments into water transport and storage for irrigation, for example, if you rely on bioenergy, but also some of the options like nuclear or centralized solar power have additional water need, which are compensated to some extent by wind and solar, which have lower water needs than those other investments. 2 minutes. That will work out perfectly. Then an area where we see very big synergies. This is air pollution. Obviously, reducing greenhouse gases means we phase out fossil fuels, and by reducing fossil fuels, we also reduce the pollutant emissions. And annually, we would reduce here the investment needs from about 200 billion to roughly 130 billion, so a little bit less than halving those costs. Food security costs, that might be one of the bigger concerns. Food security is here measured as investments or, let's say, food subsidies that would be needed in order to avoid people at risk of hunger by 2050. Obviously, the transformation will have implication, and pricing carbon will have implications for food and food prices, and this needs to be done in a way that the poorest are basically shielded to policies, and the estimation here is roughly around an increase of $40 billion investments into making food affordable during the transition. And then finally, there are, of course, also other objectives, like, for example, the objective of education, which will not be impacted, for example, by investment decisions in the energy sector. There are also many others that we could not assess in this paper, like, for example, investment needs in order to avoid trade-offs with biodiversity, or other synergies that we did not take into account, but we could, at least in the paper, to look into the side effects in terms of investment needs for some of the SDGs here. Yeah, and this is also the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay. We're going to take some quick questions of clarification. Clarification only, please, at this stage. We've got a discussant to come, and then we're going to open up for more general comments. So just if things you didn't really understand. I see 2 hands over here. And 1 here, so it's quite a lot of clarification required by the look of things. Keep the questions short, please, because obviously we are time constrained.
Thank you, Helen Santiago, Finn, climate urbanist and researcher. I'm curious, why did you not prioritize SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities?
Okay, that's this kind of length of question I like. Question at the front here, and then there are 2 gentlemen sitting over on the left.
Yeah, Kevin Urama from the African Development Bank. Similarly, why not look at the implications for poverty alleviation? SDG 1.
Okay, you missed some out, you see. We're always going to find that people are going to pick them up. So we've got a couple more there.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentations. The questions regarding the scenario for the 2 degrees and 1.5 scenario, what's the role of nuclear in comparison to not just add up more renewables or the energy efficiency investments?
And then there were 2 here, which are actually the 2 that I saw right at the beginning, but the microphone's been operating under its own steam.
Jan Siegmeier from MCC Berlin. I have one question regarding the cost of infrastructure. How do they factor into your cost estimates? I mean, real infrastructure as in grid, waterways, roads, and so on.
And then there was a gentleman there And this is absolutely the last one.
Okay, I make it quick. Alexander Pfeiffer, University of Oxford. You showed what needs to happen with coal investments. Did you also look at gas in specific?
Now, Keywan, you could clearly take up the rest of the session answering those questions because there are lots of them. Have you made a note of those questions, in fact? Are they just... They're in your head. Okay, very quickly then. Otherwise, I was going to ask you to come back to them at the end. But,
okay, so let me perhaps start with why did we miss, I think, 13 other SDGs. There is no preference from our side in trying to say that one SDG is more important than any other. These are those where we are scientifically able to estimate investment trade-offs at the moment. So it's also about what we can scientifically, in a rigorous way, do right now. Actually, I had this slide here, which I didn't show, but which shows, for example, trade-off and synergies across 21 different SDG dimensions of these scenarios. So the story itself is richer, but investments we can, in a rigorous way, not assess for all of these different dimensions. The other question was about coal and whether we have the numbers for gas as well. Yes, gas is the investments in gas are part of this assessment. Gas is a bridging technology in some of the scenarios, but is also phased out in others. So I would say we can discuss this bilaterally. There is not as robust. The conclusion with respect to gas is not as robust as the phase out for coal. Some models see actually also space for further increase of gas, particularly because it's a very flexible technology and can provide backup. And then there was the fourth question about nuclear, I think. Nuclear, actually we have scenarios in the portfolio which phase out nuclear while they try to meet these targets. It's very dependent on how effective and successful one is in terms of pushing on the demand side. So you need a fundamental transformation of demand as well. You need to keep demand very low. Then you size the system differently, and then you can remove some of the options from the table. If one is not successful at the demand side, it becomes more and more difficult to remove options like CCS or nuclear from the portfolio, and that's shown also quite nicely by the analysis. I think these were all the questions, right? Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to move on to a more developing country focus. We're going to hear from Alejandro Moreno, and your program here, at least my program, says rather cryptically, previously at the World Bank. I looked up his bio, and it seems that he's now at the Department of Energy, working in the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewables there. But while he was at the World Bank, he was focusing very much on this area. Alejandro, welcome. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Marianne, and to the organizers of the conference. I'm delighted to be here. Let's see. Yes, the government prefers its operatives to be men of mystery. No, we're not allowed to use our titles in any for anything that isn't specifically in when we're representing the government ourselves. So that's thus the mystery. Paul, you're right. This presentation will be a little bit different from the last one. I'm here. I'm going to present the results of a recent World Bank study. Policy research working paper that examines the diffusion of traditional power sector reforms, those that were prescribed by the Washington Consensus, across mostly developing countries over the last 20 years. This is the first step in a broader initiative that's just underway right now to critically re-examine those policy prescriptions and understand whether they need to be revised, and if so, just exactly how so. And I'm here on behalf of my co-authors, Vivian Foster, Sudeshna Banerjee, and Samantha Vitta. It's worth noting that Vivian Foster will be the lead, or is the lead, on this broader initiative called the Rethinking Power Sector Reform Initiative, which is looking to potentially revise these broader reform prescriptions. Just as a quick background, since I know there are a number of people here that are from sectors other than the energy sector, Since the 1990s, the World Bank, along with pretty much all of the development institutions, has promoted a fairly comprehensive and standardized package of reforms, of policy steps in the power sector, driven again by the Washington Consensus, so-called Washington Consensus, specifically focused at the liberalization and ultimately the privatization of the power sector in developing countries. The objectives, of course, is to increase the efficiency and reduce the cost of the sector, ultimately allow more power to be produced and delivered to more people at a lower cost. And it really was developed and inspired by some pretty notable successes, including in developing countries. The classic example is Chile in the late 1980s and early 1990s that saw, by implementing this model, really significant increases in performance of their sector, lower cost, greater efficiency, and perhaps even more important, nearly universal access to electricity among their populations. That said, the reforms were, as I said, they were largely created and designed as a one-size-fits-all package. They didn't have much allowance for the individual circumstances or the characteristics of specific countries. And if you even just a cursory look around the world today makes it clear they haven't exactly been embraced widely everywhere. And really, as we'll see, the diffusion has stagnated quite markedly over the last decade. So given that, and given, as we heard from Mar earlier, the major technological changes that are sweeping through the power sector right now, the bank thinks that now is a good time to take a step back and critically re-examine how and exactly how and in what order these policies and these reforms have been undertaken in developing countries, to what extent they've achieved the objectives that they were set out to achieve in increasing performance of the power sector, what really are the characteristics that make them more or less likely to succeed in different places, and ultimately to what extent do we need to revise our prescriptions by and large for developing countries in increasing the performance of the sector. It's worth noting this isn't specific to renewables or to green growth, but obviously as renewables become a larger and more financially sustainable part of the power sector, everything we do here is as critical to the development of renewables in developing countries as it is to any other form of generation. So this paper just takes the very first part of that initiative. It just looks at where and in what order the reforms have been implemented in various countries across the world. I'll present a number of our high-level findings here, but obviously the paper itself goes into significantly more depth. Two really important caveats before we get started. The first is this is a descriptive, not in any way a normative exercise, and you may hear me slip into language like this country is ahead or certain types of countries lag in the reform index that we've developed. That just means they've implemented fewer reforms. It does not in any way mean they're making good or bad policy choices. And in a related way, we're not saying anything about the impacts of these reforms. We're simply saying whether or not they're in place. The broader analysis piece will look at the impacts. Quickly, the primary data sources for this exercise were the RISE, the Regulatory Indicators for Sustainable Energy, and the PPI database. It does mean that our denominator, our base number of countries that we've looked at isn't every single developing country in the world. It's total 110 countries. About 85 of those are developing countries, but it does cover well over 95% of the world's population and energy use. It does mean there's therefore a little bit of a bias towards large countries, though. The vast majority of those countries that were excluded are very, very small. And before we dive in, let's take again a second to make sure everybody's on the same page of what exactly that standard power sector reform package looks like. It comprises 4 distinct areas. The first is regulation, ensuring that there's an independent entity in charge of regulating the sector, devising and enforcing those regulations to make sure no entities and no bodies receive preferential treatment. Second is restructuring, which is separating out each part of the supply chain, generation, transmission, distribution, into individual companies. The third is creating structures for multiple companies to compete directly against each other predominantly in the generation and in the distribution section, and private sector participation, which is fairly straightforward, but ultimately was the goal of these Washington Consensus reforms. And you can see here we've also created a rough index to measure to what extent these reforms have been taken up in a given country, and it's just a straight average of the scores for each. If you're familiar with the sector, you've probably already figured out exactly the scoring mechanism. If not, just for questions of time, I'm not going to walk through this in detail, but happy to take questions on it. So what did we find? Go through each one of these in detail, but if you can read fast, you've figured out that the short version is the vast majority of countries undertook some elements of the reform, but by and large not at all in the way or to the extent that was initially conceived by the designers of the reforms. So our first finding was developing countries, perhaps not surprisingly, lag quite far behind. They've implemented far less of the reform package than developed countries, but many developed countries have implemented relatively little of it themselves. As you can see here on the right, developing countries are far less likely to have implemented significant either competition or restructuring. The bars there represent the average score on each sub-index, with developing countries in dark blue and developed countries in light blue. And while they're roughly developing and developed countries are roughly equally likely to have some amount of privatization in their power sector, developed countries have far greater share of private participation. You will see, of course, the counterexamples, developed countries, like Japan and Korea, that still predominantly have vertically integrated power sectors, as well as France is a good example of one that has gone through the unbundling phase, but still has the government owning roughly 90% of the capital in the sector. Second major finding, as I alluded to before, the reforms have effectively run out of steam in the last decade. There have been far less uptake since about 2005. And if you see here, this graph shows the index in scores on each sub-index from 1995 through 2015. If you draw a line somewhat in the middle there around 2005, you'll see from 95 to 2005, there was an increase in scores from about 12.5 to about 35, which shows that significant amounts of these reforms were undertaken in that time period, but much, much slower increase over the last 10 years, showing that the speed of these reforms has effectively stagnated. And you can see this difference even more starkly when looking at individual steps in the process. And this graph shows the percentage of countries that took a given step in the period of 1995 to 2005 in dark blue, and in 2005 to 2015 in the light blue. And you can see across the board, almost every key step was much more likely to be undertaken between 95 and 2005 than in the decade following that. And just for those wondering, these are percentages of countries that hadn't already taken that step for both bars. The third finding, that instead of treating the package as a whole, countries tended to select very specific items to implement, and usually those were the items that were likely to be politically easiest. And you can see on the left here, more countries than not have created a regulatory entity and have allowed private sector participation in generation. Both of those, it's worth noting, don't require any substantial restructuring or reduction in the existing institutions in the power sector. They're simply adding another body or another form of generation and institution alongside what already exists. On the far other side, full vertical and horizontal unbundling and competitive power markets require generally a complete overhaul of the sector and all of the vested interests within it. Fourth, related, in the developing countries, power sector reform is stuck at an intermediate stage in many cases. And if you see here the world map, that medium color of blue, and we really need to expand our color palette here, from Russia down to Mongolia, Kazakhstan, China, those are countries that score between 33 and 66 on our index, which by definition are in the intermediate stage. And you see really the only continent to have progressed beyond that of developing countries is Latin America, where the vast majority are in a more advanced stage of reform. And you can see a little bit more clearly here, this is all of the countries we looked at. And you can see, there's a relatively normal distribution, and both scores above 80 among developing countries, and very, very low scores are relatively uncommon. Most countries have taken some of these measures, but very few have taken all of them. Very few have taken none. Fifth major finding, no surprise, that the uptake of reforms is really dramatically affected by key characteristics of the country, specifically the income level and the size of the power system. And you see here the average index scores by income group and by system size, with obvious major increases among wealthier and larger countries. This is probably a good moment to take a step back and remind ourselves of the caveat that this is purely normative. It makes perfect sense that smaller countries and lower income countries perhaps haven't progressed all the way to a competitive market. The transaction costs of doing so are potentially considerably higher, and the advantage is significantly lower. So just because the country hasn't progressed, again, doesn't mean that it's necessarily making poor policy decisions. Another way of looking at this is by region. You can see Latin America is the gray bar on the top, ECA, Europe and Central Asia, the red bar there, or orange, I guess. And you can see they have much higher scores, while the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa have much lower scores. I really like this graph because it shows very clearly and in a somewhat different way that slowdown of uptake since 2005 or so. And you can see it's been a little bit different in each region, but you really get the impression that for each region, all of the countries that were going to take certain reforms took them in a relatively short period of time, and very little has happened since. Perhaps ironically, the only exception to that is Sub-Saharan Africa, which has seen, although slow but steady, increase in the index scores throughout the period since 1995. Sixth finding, that power sector reforms were, these measures were designed not only as a package, but with a logical sequence to be undertaken, where certain reforms were predicated on previous reforms having been taken. If you've been paying attention, you can imagine how that probably played out in real life. The actual philosophy was first you establish a regulatory agency to establish the fair playing field and rules. Then you need to unbundle the existing activity to create the separate legal and corporate structures that you could then introduce competition. And the theory was, at least, that you would introduce competition and private sector participation in the distribution side first, because that would create the solid financial footing for the entire sector and then allow the generators to be paid the cost of the power they were producing. In reality, it was implemented nothing like that, where you see many countries took steps in a very different sequence, including about 15% of countries that adopted competition without the relevant unbundling, which meant you had private sector participants potentially competing against a state-owned vertically integrated utility with all of the conflict of interest that could bring about. You also see similar numbers of countries introducing private sector participation or some competition without a regulator, creating similar potential issues. Seventh finding, the announced reforms. Countries often announced broad, wide, far-reaching reforms, but implemented them either much later or not at all. And here's an example from Pakistan, where the bars in the foreground are the actual implemented power sector, the scores based on what reforms have actually been implemented. In the background are what the scores would have been if all of the announced reforms had taken place. And you see in 1992, Pakistan announced a comprehensive set of power sector reforms and did nothing for a number of years. It wasn't until 1998 that the majority of those reforms were undertaken. And now, more or less, Pakistan has reached a point where the initial 1992 legislation had envisioned. Senegal is a little bit of a different story, where you saw some reforms beginning with IPPs in the late 90s, and a law was passed in 1998 to restructure the sector and to privatize Senelec. That the law was not implemented, and in fact, in 2001, the privatization of Senelec was reversed, where you see a little bit of a dip in the overall score. And still today, Senegal hasn't come anywhere near where that reform package passed almost 20 years ago had envisioned. And that brings us to our last finding, which is the reforms are in fact reversible. And you do see certain cases particularly related to private sector participation. And we looked at 20 countries and found 40 transactions that were reversed in the last 25 years. The majority of these were in Sub-Saharan Africa, although those countries only comprise 7 of the 20 countries in the sample. And these reversals were overwhelmingly related to private sector participation in distribution, either through concessions or divestitures. And they were, it's worth noting, instigated the reversals not only by the government, often because of nationalization of assets, but almost as often by the private sector participants who were not, ultimately decided they either couldn't make money or had disagreements regarding the terms of their contracts. So ultimately, what does this all mean? What's clear is that what was conceived as a coherent package and sequence of reforms has been adapted in really myriad ways by different countries. Developing countries aren't nearly as far along as developed countries, and the vast majority are stuck somewhere in the middle. But perhaps most importantly, what is meant by the middle really differs from country to country. And most importantly, it doesn't seem to be based on this initial logical sequence of steps, but really on which steps were most politically expedient for a given country, which has left countries with very, very different looking patchwork reforms that were picked and chosen from this overall package. Now, what does this mean for the impact and the effectiveness of the reforms? Well, for that, you'll have to stay tuned for the results of the Rethinking Power Sector Reform Initiative.
Well, thank you very much, Alejandro. And we'll have exactly the same business now of asking if there are any questions, clarification. I don't see hands going up, so I'm going to move straight on, take the opportunity to our discussant of the session, Najib Saab, Arab Forum for Environment and Development. He's been asked not to prepare a presentation, but just to make some comments on the two presentations that we've heard. Najib, nice to have you with us. Please, 5 minutes. Thanks.
Good morning.
No, the other one.
The red light is what you want.
Yes?
Yeah.
Good morning. Actually, I shall not take their role. They gave very good presentations. I shall not take your role. You will give questions. I read the two papers before. I found them very informative. I shall concentrate on 2 points and reflect on my region so that we don't all talk about the whole world. One thing which I noticed in the World Bank paper is the following. You didn't concentrate, you said you were just 10 years was due to countries, as if it says this. While I think it is time to rethink whether there was a problem, structural problem, in the suggested reforms, prescribed reforms themselves. Maybe yes, maybe not, but just to concentrate on this issue. Of the two papers, I take 2 points. First, for the investment needs for energy, I look at one thing important, the mix between reallocation of funds, which is very important. Sometimes we don't look at it, we look only at fresh funding needs, while for so many years, reallocation of funds might solve big problems. The other point is the impact of policies and regulations as a driving force to achieve sustainable energy. Now, I reflect on those on my region, the Arab countries, my organization. We are a think tank concentrating on policy matters in the 22 Arab countries. We produce annual report on the state of Arab environment. So once each 10 years, it is general. It's our 10th year. So the 10th report was just produced 2 weeks ago. And in between, we take topical issues. Now, I talk about our region from our last findings. In the energy sector, we feel that the climate change discussion was the main turning point for the Arab countries, especially the oil producers, to think seriously about energy efficiency, renewable energy, and to take phasing out subsidies seriously. Those were not heard of before. So when my organization proposed 5 years ago, only 5, not 20 years ago, to phase out subsidies, the answer from the Deputy Minister of Energy in Kuwait was in public, who are you to preach us how we spend our money and our oil? The same man now, or actually woman, she does not accept phasing out subsidies. She wants to cut subsidies altogether. Now, we were asking them to diversify the economy and to prepare for soft landing. Now, because of the low prices of oil and the impact of Paris Agreement, they are going into crash landing, but better than nothing. Now, certainly in the Arab countries, they are pushing to diversify the economy. We take the Saudi Vision 2030 plan. It is the most radical development plan ever in the region, changing not only the economy, the society itself, if they succeed to implement it. They have now 12 countries out of the 22 members of the League of Arab States, including mainly all oil exporting countries. They have energy efficiency targets, renewable energy targets, energy efficiency labels, and just sometimes you might not understand the situation if you don't have some examples. Only 5 years ago, in most of the Arab Gulf states, they were not asked to put not the carbon dioxide emissions of cars. The consumption of cars was not obligatory to be mentioned. The idea was the following, and they said it openly, that it's not to our advantage to consume less petrol because oil is used mainly in the transport sector. So if we do it in our country to be more efficient, we are giving the wrong signal to the world. Now things have changed completely. Last month, Saudi Arabia, they had big shipment of home appliances, electrical appliances, which did not conform to the energy labels. It was sent back. This was unheard of 1 year ago, not only 5 years ago. So you have real drive. I give one example of Jordan. Jordan now, and it will be a shocking figure for you. This year, 74% of the cars imported are electric and hybrid. Why? Because they had regulations started in 2009 to give incentives for this. I mean, Jordan, they don't produce oil, and they have big problem for air pollution in cities, mainly in Amman, and this is helping really solving it. Now, the last thing from my region is that sometimes some slogans are used in the wrong direction. Energy mix. Energy mix, in many cases, it's good to have energy mix, but in some cases, energy mix is used to say, to achieve energy mix, we have to use coal and nuclear. The nuclear, by the way, to our opinion in AFID, it is not used in some countries to produce energy. It is a pretext energy just to say we have to stand for Iran to have also nuclear technology. So, and coal is the most ridiculous. The region does not produce coal, and you have now a drive to build some electricity generating plants using imported coal, like in Dubai. Now, so this is under the cover of energy mix. Now, another cover is to fight energy poverty, because out of 350 million people in the Arab countries, you have 50 million with no access to modern energy. So some sectors until today, they use this as a pretext for the need to produce energy at any cost, even if it is dirty, to reach those 50 million. But now this is outdated of what we heard also today. You can produce energy for those people, still being clean energy. So,
okay, thank you very much, Najib. Now, we started this session a little late, so I'm proposing to eat somewhat into your coffee time, if that's all right. I'll have a quick look at the boss. Yes, the boss is nodding and says that's fine. So we're going to have some discussion, which is great. There's a gentleman here, and then Ma at the front here. Please introduce yourself. Feel free to make a comment, but make it brief. And then if you have a question to the presenters, please, let's have that too. So do we have the mics roving about? Our roving microphone appears to have gone missing. That's lovely. Thank you. If you could pass it to... why don't we start with Mara as it's there? Oh, no, okay. Start with Mara as it's there, and then we'll go.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much for presenting your work. Very, very interesting. I had a question for Alejandro. I was wondering if part of your initiative is thinking about revising or revisiting the prescriptions from the 90s, thinking about the massive transition that we're observing in the electricity sector, and, for example, thinking about how those original transitions is or difficult pushing for these 100% renewables.
Thanks, Ma. I was going to think of the same question. Obviously, a very good one. I'm going to take a number of questions, so just think of your response, and then we'll come back to you at the end. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Raouf Dabbas. I'm the Vice President of a non-governmental organization in Jordan, Friends of Environment Society. I have actually 3 quick questions to ask, please, if you don't mind. The first one is regarding, again, the nuclear option that you had showed as one of the options to do so to achieve the goal of Paris Agreement to reach 2 or 1.5%. And I don't think it's being thought of in a complete, to borrow a term from the environment, the entire catchment area, because the impact of extraction of this mineral called uranium and its grave impacts on the environment, the huge amount of water consumption it needs for all processes, starting also from the enrichment all the way through to the cooling. I think these studies that you are giving, and maybe you can shed more light on it, is only showing the production phase, the energy phase, downstream. I think it needs to take into account the upstream impacts on environmental variables, especially water, and also the environmental impact assessments that have not been achieved or conducted properly in parts of the world in developing countries. So Jordan is going to a nuclear phase, so Saudi Arabia and Emirates, and none of them, and I challenge them, have done any environmental impact assessment study because they go purely on the scientific part of this. So that's...
Okay, Rolf, if I may, I'm just going to hold you there. That's one question, because we're going to run out of time otherwise. I'll come back to you if it looks as if we're going to have any more time, because I'm aware you've got more to say. We've got another question here.
Again, Kevin Urama from the African Development Bank. My question is more of for what we've heard so far. What can we learn from the rate of uptake of this program Alejandro presented for us? We're now about 15 years into the process. So, and from what you're showing us, the uptake has not been that great and has been varied across the regions. What can we learn from that process and the current transitions that we are asking for, i.e. achieving COP21 agreements? And I'm also thinking of the other issue, the other end of it. We have the INDCs made by the countries themselves in terms of what they can do in the foreseeable future. And what was shown by Riahi is showing that that's not enough. So how can we push countries to do more than they can or they have accepted to do?
Any other questions before we go back to the speakers? Rolf, you're number 2.
This one is for also Alejandro in terms of the regulation. Many of the countries, such in the Middle East again, have indeed implemented a large amount of regulating legislation that promotes the renewables. But what I think is many of them now are looking back at those legislations and threatening those developments that they have done in the past 5 years and regressing somewhat. And my question is, the sustainability factor can only be measured if there's something in it for the government. And that's what's missing. What do you think about the carbon initiative, carbon trading? That is non-existent anymore on the Paris Agreement. At least we haven't heard about it. And perhaps that should be more invested in terms of developing that market, the carbon market, and make it easy attainable for developing countries. Thank you.
Okay, I see one hand right at the back there. And then we'll take one more question at the front, and then that's the end of questions, and the speakers can respond very quickly.
My name is Charles Akol. I'm from the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. I think mine is related to what my colleague from the African Development Bank has said. But rather than pushing countries, but are there ways we can create incentives for governments to use the limited public resources to leverage private investments towards getting investments towards climate resilient and green infrastructure? Here, I would like to point out the new initiative that we have, what we call the AfriRace, which is a joint initiative of the African Development Bank, ECA, and the World Bank, which is trying to provide ways of making sure that we catalyze investment in renewable infrastructure.
Okay, and then the final question at the front here.
Yeah, Jim Hall from the University of Oxford again. A question for Alejandro on the observation you made about retraction of private sector participation in distribution utilities. And I wonder whether you'd expand upon that. It seems to speak to the relatively high capital costs of distribution, low affordability, possibly low willingness to pay beyond very basic electricity services. So I wonder whether you could comment on that.
Okay, well, thank you. That was really great. Alejandro, I'm going to come to you first because most of the questions were for you and to do with rethinking the power sector in the context of the new energy transition, which obviously when this original program was put together wasn't there. What was it well thought through and was it well founded to start with? And what about infrastructure and paying for stuff?
I will do my best to answer. I will do my best to answer all of these quickly, but I trust you'll yank me if I go too long. The first question, Mar, to yours, and I think this is similar to Najib, what you asked was, to what extent were we actually coming at this with the idea that we would potentially revise the policy prescriptions? And I hope to make that clear, but obviously I didn't. That was absolutely the intention. The thought was for a number of different reasons. And I mean, just broadly, when you see such a low level of uptake across so many countries, you have to take the step that, okay, this isn't all these countries are screwing up. There is something structurally that isn't working in this suite of reforms. Either it wasn't the right set at the beginning or something has changed in the environment. So absolutely that is the intent, is to go back and revisit and update the prescription. And I think very clearly, maybe this gets to what did we learn, but you know, so I'm in a little bit of an awkward place because the actual results will come out in a year. So I'm now just sort of speaking off the top of my head what I think is likely. But you know, certainly having this one-size-fits-all package that isn't designed with individual country characteristics in mind, I think we're likely to find that is not a tremendously effective approach, or it's one that needs to have substantial flexibility built into it. So in terms of what we can learn, certainly that. And also, you know, it's very clear that where countries diverged from the prescribed sequencing, it was done in a way that effectively you could see governments asking the question that you just asked, what's in it for the governments, or how can we avoid some of the potential political economy concerns? And so you see that, you know, the vast majority of countries allowed some degree of private participation in generation. Well, you can, from a government perspective, whether you're being cynical or not, you can certainly see that there could be gains from the government in that process. At the very least, it's not tremendously destabilizing for the existing industry. And when you are prescribing reforms that really do threaten very entrenched vested interests, and sometimes interests that are required for the government to function in other ways, perfectly legitimate interests, you can't just go in with a perspective of, well, this is technically what you need. You really need to be able to carve interventions that address the needs and the circumstances of individual countries. And I think that's very likely what we're going to come out of this. The question, how can we push countries to go a little bit further? This is beyond this particular project. This project is really just looking at the fundamentals of power sector health and financial sustainability. So it's effectively creating the playing field or the foundation upon which you can then push governments or use policies to to go further and get specific, say, energy efficiency or renewable energy outcomes that you want. One of the other mechanisms I mentioned, though, one of the projects that's provided data for this is the Regulatory Indicators for Sustainable Energy. That project is looking at specifically what energy efficiency, renewable energy, and energy access policies are in place in that same suite of 110 countries and effectively scoring countries based on that. So, for example, Jordan having regulations for energy efficiency of vehicles, or Saudi Arabia putting labels for energy efficiency, that would get reflected in that scorecard effectively and would be communicated and hopefully both serve as a way to reward countries for doing that and also push dialogue as to which policies are most effective.
Okay, I think we need to move on. Thank you. Najib, I'm going to ask you just briefly to comment on the contribution of your colleague from the Middle East, and then I'll come to Riahi for the final word. So very quickly, please.
I mean, very, very quickly, I want to add something, because the information I gave, I think most of it in that time was negative. We have some positive things. Saudi Arabia, I mean, we won't imagine this. Saudi Arabia, in their plan, is to produce 9.5 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030 and 54 gigawatts by 2040. So it is just near. They didn't say 50 years. So they are really moving. Something else, I mean, just to give the stress on regulations, how can you invite the private sector to participate? The biggest private sector operator in the energy and water sector in the Arab region is a Saudi company called Aqua Power. Aqua Power was the one behind all what you heard in Morocco, for example. They were big players in UAE and Jordan, but not in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, they executed government projects, not as a partner. Because in Morocco and in Jordan and in UAE, the laws invited the private sector to invest. They gave them security, longer-term security. The first time Aqua Power invested in Saudi Arabia as a private company, as private investment, was this year, because the laws changed in this direction. The third comment is that for the first time also this year, commercial banks in countries in the region, mainly Jordan and UAE and Lebanon, although Lebanon is lagging in everything except in this, started to give loans to renewable energy projects, to private companies. This didn't happen before. They had to go to the international organizations. But this happened not only because the private banks did this, because the central banks put rules in place to support the private banks to do this.
Okay, thank you very much. We need to move on. Keywan, perhaps you'd just like to address the issue of nuclear. Are we getting it right? We had a question from the floor there in terms of its assessment.
Yeah, so coming back to your question about nuclear, which I think is an important one. So let me clarify what is in the models and what has been, so what is considered and what is not. So generally, as I showed, and as you mentioned also, nuclear has higher water consumption because of its cooling needs. That's taken into account. The inflexibility of nuclear, usually interacting with renewables, is one of its drawbacks, has been taken into account in this analysis. Its high costs has been taken into account as well. It can contribute to some of the benefits. So nuclear basically can help with reducing health impacts from air pollution because there is no combustion involved. But I think there are political factors like how you use nuclear otherwise and its risks of accidents. I mean, proliferation and accidents is not part of the scientific assessment, right? And this needs to be part of political considerations. And that's why in some countries nuclear is basically also removed from the portfolio itself. The country that I'm coming from, Austria, you cannot build a nuclear power plant. Actually, Austria built a nuclear power plant but never turned it on, which is the worst thing to do.
Well, on that happy thought of negative infrastructure, if you like, an asset that was stranded. It's coffee, I understand, is out there. I take it we're going to start again at past. I'll hand back to Marianne and she can just tell us what's what.